The moment Patrick Winslow told Maude Abbott he did not need her help, she looked him dead in the eye, picked up his wrench, and fixed the broken windmill pump in under 4 minutes flat while he stood there with his jaw hanging open like a barn door in a storm. It was the summer of 1883 in Hays City, Kansas, and the heat had settled over the plains like a wool blanket that nobody asked for and nobody could remove. The grass along the edges of the road into town had gone the color of old straw, and the sky was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that promised nothing, not rain, not relief, not mercy. Dust traveled in long, slow columns that rose from every wagon wheel and every boot heel and every restless cattle hoof, and it coated everything it touched: fence posts, water troughs, the painted signs above the general store, and the faces of the people who lived and worked and struggled beneath it. Maude Abbott had arrived in Hays City 6 weeks prior, in the back of a supply wagon driven by a man named Gerald Finch who smelled like pipe tobacco and spoke in grunts. She had come from Wichita, where she had spent 3 years working as a mechanic's assistant in her Uncle Horace's repair shop, learning the language of gears and pressure and water flow with the same seriousness that other young women of 24 applied to embroidery and piano lessons. She was not the kind of woman who was easily impressed by things that were broken, because broken things, in her experience, were simply things that had not yet been fixed. She had no family in Hays City. What she had was a letter from a widow named Clara Dunmore, who ran a boarding house on the north side of town, and who had written to Horace Abbott asking if he knew anyone willing to come out and help manage some of the more mechanical aspects of running a property that had, in the past year, seen its water pump fail twice, its stove flue collapse once, and its chicken coop gate develop a hinge problem that was causing a significant loss of revenue in the form of escaped hens. Horace had passed the letter to Maude with a knowing look, and Maude had packed her trunk and said goodbye without looking back. Clara Dunmore was a small, sharp woman of 51 with white hair pinned severely at the back of her neck and a mouth that almost never smiled but whose eyes were capable of warmth when she chose to allow it. She had welcomed Maude with a firm handshake, shown her to a clean room on the second floor with a window that looked out over a dry garden, and said, "I do not need sentiment, I need competence. From what your uncle tells me, you have it," Maude had said. "Then we should get along fine." They did. Within the first 2 weeks, Maude had repaired the water pump, reinforced the chicken coop gate with new iron hinges she sourced from the blacksmith 2 streets over, and identified the source of a mysterious creaking in the back porch steps that had been tormenting Clara for the better part of a year. Clara, in response, had reduced Maude's board rate by half and began leaving biscuits outside her door on Sunday mornings. It was through Clara that Maude first heard about Patrick Winslow. "He runs the Ladder Creek Ranch," Clara told her one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the day cool down. "About 4 miles east of town. His father started it, God rest him. Patrick took over when he was 22 and he has been running it alone ever since." "Alone?" Maude asked. "He had a ranch hand or 2 over the years, but they never stayed long. He is not the easiest man to work alongside. He has what you might call a strong sense of his own way of doing things." "How old is he now?" 29. "Maybe 30 by now. I lose track." Clara smoothed her apron. "He comes into town once a week for supplies, always on Thursday, always before noon, never stays longer than he has to. He is polite enough when he wants to be, pays his debts promptly. But there is a wall around that man, Maude, thick as adobe, and I have not met a single person who has managed to get through it." Maude filed this information away the way she filed most information, not with any particular emotional investment, but with a quiet, methodical attention that meant it would be retrievable when she needed it. She met Patrick Winslow for the first time on a Thursday, which she supposed was inevitable. She had gone to the hardware store on behalf of Clara to pick up a length of copper pipe and a box of fittings, and she was standing at the counter discussing the diameter specifications with the shop owner, a cheerful man named Bert Haverson, when the door opened behind her, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift slightly. the way it does when someone with a considerable amount of presence walks into a space. She turned halfway and saw him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came not from deliberate effort, but from years of physical labor performed daily without rest. His hat was dark brown and worn at the brim, and beneath it his face was all sharp angles and sun-darkened planes, with dark eyes set under heavy brows and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something resistant to compromise. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands, when he set a list down on the counter beside her, were the hands of someone who had never treated them gently. "Morning, Bert," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary volume. "Morning, Patrick. Be with you in a moment." Bert glanced at Maude. "Miss Abbott, you were saying 3/4 inch." "Yes," Maude said, returning her attention to the conversation at hand, "and I will need the fittings to be threaded on both ends. Clara's existing pipe section uses a standard thread, so compatibility is important." There was a brief silence beside her. "You know pipe fittings," Patrick Winslow said. It was not a question exactly. It was more like a statement of mild disbelief delivered without inflection. Maude turned to look at him fully. "I do," she said. "Is that surprising?" He looked at her for a moment, not rudely, just directly, the way a man looks at something he is trying to measure. "A little," he said. "I worked in a repair shop for 3 years," she said. "Before that, I helped my father fix everything that broke on a farm in southern Missouri for most of my childhood. So yes, I know pipe fittings." Something moved in those dark eyes, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "Patrick Winslow," he said, and he said it without extending his hand. Maude did not take offense. She got the sense that he was not unfriendly so much as unused to the rituals of friendliness. "Maude Abbott," she said. "I am staying at Clara Dunmore's place." He nodded once. Then he turned his attention to Bert and began working through his list, and Maude collected her copper pipe and her fittings and left the store. And that was the entirety of their first meeting. She thought about it on the walk back to Clara's, not with any particular longing, but with the curious, half-puzzled feeling of someone who has encountered a mechanism they cannot immediately identify. There was something about Patrick Winslow that seemed both self-contained and, underneath that, lonely in a way that had become so familiar to him, he no longer recognized it as loneliness. She mentioned him to Clara that evening. "I met your Patrick Winslow today," she said. Clara looked up from her mending. "Did you?" He seemed. Maude paused, searching for the right word. "Closed." "That is a generous word for it," Clara said. "Some in town use less generous ones." "What happened to him? Something must have." Clara set down her mending and was quiet for a moment. "His father died when Patrick was 22. Heart gave out in the middle of a cattle drive, from what people say. His mother had passed when he was a boy, so after that it was just him and the land. He has been pouring everything he has into that ranch ever since, trying to make it what his father wanted it to be. I think somewhere along the way he decided that relying on other people was a liability he could not afford." Maude was quiet, turning this over. "That is a hard way to live," she said finally. "It is," Clara agreed, "but it is his choice to live it." 3 weeks passed. Maude saw Patrick Winslow twice more in town. Once outside the feed store, where he was loading sacks of grain into his wagon, with the efficiency of a man who has performed the same task several hundred times, and once at the post office, where they stood in adjacent positions waiting for the clerk to locate their respective mail, and said nothing to each other beyond a mutual nod of acknowledgement. Both times, Maude noticed the same quality in him, a self-sufficiency so total and so practiced that it had become indistinguishable from indifference. The windmill was the thing that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday in late July, which was a departure from the usual Thursday schedule, and therefore unusual enough that Maude noticed it immediately when she saw his wagon coming up the road from her position in the garden, where she was attempting to persuade Clara's rose bushes to stop dying. He pulled up at the hardware store, but something in the set of his shoulders as he climbed down from the wagon was different. There was a tension there, a tightness that was less like the ordinary focus of a busy man and more like the controlled urgency of someone dealing with a problem that is not going away on its own. Maude set down her trowel and watched. He came out of the hardware store a few minutes later carrying a small paper bag of parts and looking, if possible, even more tightly wound than when he had gone in. He stopped on the boardwalk and stared at the bag in his hand with the expression of a man reviewing a situation that is not going his way. She crossed the street without making any particular decision about it. It was simply what she did. "Problem," she said. He looked up. He seemed for a fraction of a second surprised to see her there. Then the familiar wall came back up. "Nothing I cannot handle," he said. "What is it?" "My windmill pump," he said it the way people say things they do not want to discuss. "The cylinder rod connection, it keeps seizing up. I have replaced the packing twice and it still locks up after about 4 days. Maude thought about this. "What material is the packing?" He paused. "Leather." "Is the rod worn at the connection point?" Another pause, longer this time. "Some," he admitted. "If the rod is worn uneven, even fresh packing will deform under pressure and seize. You need to either true the rod or install a guide bushing at the connection to compensate for the irregularity." She paused. "Do you have a guide bushing in that bag?" He looked at the bag. Then he looked at her. "No," he said. "Bert carries them. Bronze ones which will hold better than iron in that application." She tilted her head toward the hardware store. "It is a standard size if you know the cylinder diameter." He was quiet for a moment. She could see something working behind those dark eyes, not quite resistance, but something close to it, the expression of a man who has been solving his own problems for so long that accepting a solution from somewhere else requires a conscious act of will. "I know the cylinder diameter," he said at last. "Then you should go back in and get one," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, with no further acknowledgement of the exchange, he turned and went back into the hardware store. Maude returned to her garden. She thought that would be the end of it. She had given him the information, he had the means to apply it, and that was a complete transaction. The fact that she found herself thinking about the expression on his face, that brief, almost imperceptible crack in the wall when she had correctly identified his problem, was simply because she was a person who noticed things, and it did not mean anything more than that. But Clara was watching from the porch with her needle suspended in midair, and the look of a woman who has catalogued a great deal of human behavior and has very definite opinions about what she has just witnessed. "Maude," she said when Maude came back up the porch steps. "I know," Maude said. "I did not say anything." "You were about to." Clara smiled, which was rare enough to be significant. She put her needle back to work and said nothing more, and Maude went inside. It was 4 days after the windmill exchange that Patrick Winslow appeared at Clara's front gate on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands. Not literally, but in the figurative sense that his whole posture had a quality of reluctant approach that he was clearly not accustomed to. Maude was on the porch replacing a loose board when she heard the gate and looked up. He stood at the end of the front path, looking at her with the expression of a man preparing to do something that goes against his nature. He had his hat on, actually. She noted this, but it sat slightly higher on his head than usual, as though even his hat was aware of the unusual circumstances. "Miss Abbott," he said. "Mr. Winslow," she said, and set down her hammer. "The guide bushing." He stopped, started again. "I installed it the way you said, and the pump is still seizing." She waited. "I thought," he stopped again. His jaw moved. "I thought perhaps you might," he seemed to locate the word somewhere unpleasant. "If you knew of another possible cause." "I would need to see it," she said. She watched him absorb this. She could see him working through it. The acknowledgement that he had come here, that he had asked, that he was now looking at the possibility of a woman coming to his property to look at his equipment, which probably represented about 4 layers of things that went against the grain of how he lived his life. "All right," he said. She went inside, told Clara where she was going, changed out of her gardening clothes into her work skirt and boots, picked up the small canvas tool bag she kept packed and ready, and came back out to find him still standing at the gate with the exact same expression he had worn when she left. They drove out to Ladder Creek Ranch in his wagon, mostly in silence, which suited them both fine. The ranch revealed itself gradually as they came over a low rise, a main house of weathered lumber, a barn that had been well maintained, 3 paddocks, and on the far side of the property, turning in the hot breeze with an irregular sticking motion that was visible even from this distance, the windmill. "I can hear it from here," Maude said. "I have been hearing it for 2 weeks," Patrick said. She climbed down from the wagon before he had fully stopped it and walked to the windmill, while he was still tying off the reins. By the time he caught up to her, she had already opened the lower access panel and was shining a small hand mirror to direct the sunlight into the mechanism. "Do not," he started. "I am not touching anything," she said, without looking up. "I am looking." He stood behind her and watched her look, and she could feel the particular quality of his attention, watchful, skeptical, but not dismissive. He was paying the kind of attention you pay to something you want to find wrong but keep finding right. "Here," she said. She pointed to a spot inside the mechanism where a secondary connecting pin had worn through its cotter ring, which meant that the rod was not moving cleanly on its stroke, but was instead describing a very slight arc at the bottom of its range, which put uneven pressure on the packing regardless of what bushing was installed to accommodate the rod wear. "The packing was never the root problem," she said, sitting back on her heels. "The cotter ring wore through, and nobody saw it because the pin itself looks fine. But the pin is wobbling at the base of every stroke, and that wobble is what is seizing the packing." Silence. She looked up at him. He was staring at the inside of the mechanism with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not anger, and it was not embarrassment exactly, though there was something in the neighborhood of both. Mostly it was the expression of someone who has been struggling with a problem for a long time and has just been shown, in a matter of minutes, where the problem actually lives. "I replaced everything but that," he said, very quietly. "You replaced the symptoms," she said, not unkindly. "It is easy to do when you are working alone, and the noise is the same every time." He said nothing. She opened her tool bag and found a replacement cotter ring that was, with a small amount of persuasion, a workable fit. She installed it in 11 minutes. She moved with the economy of someone who has performed similar repairs enough times that the movements have become part of her muscle memory. And she did not ask for any assistance, though she could feel him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with oversight and everything to do with something he was not yet ready to name. When she was done, she stood up and dusted her hands on her skirt and said, "Try it." He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he reached over and engaged the mechanism. The windmill turned, and the pump cycled, and it was smooth and clean and quiet except for the ordinary sound of water moving through the pipe, which was a very satisfying sound. He stood with his hand still on the lever, and his face turned away from her, looking out across his land toward the horizon, and there was a long silence that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but that had a weight to it, the weight of a man who is being honest with himself in a way that is new. Then he turned back to her, and he looked at her with those dark, serious eyes, and he said, "Thank you." He said it quietly, and he said it simply, and it was 2 words, but Maude Abbott understood immediately that he had not said merely "thank you." He had said something considerably more complicated than that, something about being wrong, and about the difficulty of being wrong, and about what it meant to be helped by someone you had decided did not know enough to help you, and about the fact that the world was sometimes different from the version of it you had been carrying around in your head for years. He had said all of that in 2 words and meant every syllable of the parts he had not spoken. She looked at him and said, "You are welcome," and meant a few things of her own. They drove back to town in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence. Something had shifted between them, not dramatically, not in the way of stories where one dramatic gesture transforms everything, but in the way of real things where a small, true moment creates a foundation that was not there before. He stopped the wagon in front of Clara's. "What do I owe you?" he asked. Nothing, she said. The cotter ring was mine and it cost me about 8 cents. That is not what I mean. I know. She climbed down. You do not owe me anything for this, Mr. Winslow. I like the problem. She went inside without looking back, and she did not need to look back to know that he sat there for a moment before he clicked the horses into motion, because she could feel it. Clara was in the kitchen making bread, and she looked up when Maude came in and did not say anything at all, which meant she was saying everything. Maude sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Do not." "I have not said a word," Clara said. "You were about to say several." "I was thinking them very loudly," Clara allowed. Maude picked up an apple from the bowl on the table and bit into it and stared at the wall. "He said thank you," she said after a moment. "Was that noteworthy?" "It was the way he said it." Clara worked her bread dough in silence for a moment. "He came back, Maude. That man does not ask for help. He certainly does not ask for help from—" She paused tactfully. "From a woman," Maude said. "I was going to say from anyone at all, but yes." Maude ate her apple and thought about the way the light had been on his face when the pump ran clean and smooth, the way his jaw had been tight with some emotion she could not entirely name, the two words he had said as though they contained a whole language she was only beginning to learn. "He is lonely," she said. "He is terrified," Clara said. "There is a difference." Maude thought about this. "Is there?" Lonely people want company and do not have it. Terrified people push company away because they are afraid of what happens when they let it in. She shaped the bread dough with practiced efficiency. "He is the second kind." "What is he afraid of?" Clara looked at her. "Losing it," she said simply. "He lost his father. He lost any sense of a world that was going to take care of him. So now he takes care of everything himself, and he holds himself so tightly that nothing can get in to hurt him, and he does not notice that he is also holding so tightly that nothing good can get in either." Maude sat with this for a long time. The following Thursday, Patrick came into town on his usual schedule. Maude was at the post office again, as it happened, picking up a parcel of parts that her uncle had sent from Wichita. She was reading the label on the parcel and frowning slightly because one of the items was missing from the inventory list when she heard the door and looked up. He saw her immediately. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but a softening, the way a field looks when the light changes on it. "Miss Abbott," he said. "Mr. Winslow." She tucked the parcel under her arm. "Your pump's still running clean." "As of this morning," he said. "Yes." They stood in the middle of the post office, and the clerk pretended to be very busy with a stack of envelopes that did not require the amount of attention he was giving them. "I wanted to ask you something," Patrick said. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about saying for several days and has finally decided to commit to. "Not about the pump." "All right," she said. "There is a dance at the Grange Hall Saturday week. I was wondering—" He stopped. Something flickered in his expression. She got the sense that this particular sentence had not been spoken by him in quite some time, possibly ever, and that the path from beginning to end of it was not familiar territory. "I was wondering if you might want to come with me." The post office was very quiet. Maude Abbott looked at Patrick Winslow, at the set of his jaw, and the slight tension around his eyes, and the careful stillness of a man who is trying very hard to appear as though the answer does not matter while it is abundantly clear that it matters considerably. And she felt something warm move through her chest, something she had not felt in quite this way before, which was both inconvenient and undeniable. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The tension around his eyes eased very slightly. "Saturday week," he said. "I could pick you up at 7. 7 is fine," she said. He nodded, and the transaction was complete, and he went to collect his mail, and Maude walked out into the bright Kansas morning with her parcel under her arm and her heart doing something irregular that she chose to attribute to the heat. She told Clara when she got home. Clara sat down. "Clara, you never sit down unless something has gone wrong." "I am sitting down because something has gone right," Clara said. "And it has been so long since that happened that my legs gave out from the novelty of it." Maude laughed, which felt good, and then tried to be sensible about it. which felt less good and was considerably less successful. The days between that Thursday and the Saturday of the dance had a different quality to them, a kind of aliveness, a heightened attention to detail. Maude noticed things she might not otherwise have noticed. The way the evening light came through the window of her room at a particular angle and turned everything gold, the sound of the wind in the cottonwood trees that grew along the back fence, the specific weight of anticipation, which was different from dread even though it occupied some of the same physical territory. She had a dress. It was blue-gray, the color of a sky just before it decides what kind of day it will be. She had brought it from Wichita without any particular occasion in mind, just because she liked it and she thought it would do. Clara thought it would do considerably more than that, and said so with characteristic directness when she saw Maude in it Saturday evening. "You look lovely," she said. "Do not argue with me." "I was not going to argue with you. You were going to say something self-deprecating about the hem." Maude looked at the hem. It could be let down a half-inch. "It could not," Clara said firmly, and pinned Maude's hair up with the efficient confidence of a woman who has no patience for unnecessary doubts. At 7 o'clock exactly, there was a knock at the front door. Patrick Winslow was standing on the porch in a clean white shirt and dark trousers and his least battered hat, and he had combed his hair, and there was a quality to him that she had not seen before, a kind of careful effort that was all the more moving for how unused to it he clearly was. He looked like a man who had taken pains, and who was slightly uncertain whether the pains had been sufficient, and who would never in 1,000 years say any of this out loud. "Evening, Miss Abbott," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Winslow," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, honest eyes. "You look—" He stopped. "So do you," she said gently. Something eased in his expression, and he offered her his arm and she took it. And that simple act of contact, her hand on his arm, the warmth of him through the clean white fabric felt like something more significant than it should have. And she was beginning to think that most things involving Patrick Winslow felt more significant than they should. The Grange Hall was lit up and loud, full of the good-natured collision of people who do not often have occasion to be in the same room and are making the most of it. There was a fiddle player who was excellent and a banjo player who was enthusiastic, and the combination produced music that was impossible to stand still to. The smell was candle wax and sawdust and women's lilac water, and the particular warm human smell of a room full of people who have been working hard all week and are now, briefly, not working. People noticed them come in together. Maude noticed the noticing without being unsettled by it. In a town this size, any change in the established order of things was observed and catalogued immediately, and Patrick Winslow arriving at the Grange Hall with a woman on his arm was, by any measure, a significant change in the established order. She felt him register the attention too, a slight stiffening, the instinct of a private person suddenly in public view, and she pressed her hand slightly on his arm, just barely, just enough. He looked down at her. "I would like a glass of water," she said, "and then I would like to stand against that wall and watch the dancing for a while, and that should give everyone time to get used to us." He blinked. Then the corner of his mouth moved, and she realized she was witnessing something rare, something approaching a real, unguarded smile, emerging like the first evidence of water from a dry well. "That is sensible," he said. "I am a sensible person," she said. They got water. They stood against the wall. The room made its assessments and then, in the way of such things, turned most of its attention back to itself. By the second song they had been absorbed into the background of the evening, which was exactly what she had intended. "You managed that," he said. "You were about to bolt," she said. "I was not. You were considering it." A pause. "Maybe considering it," he allowed. She smiled and looked out at the dancers, and felt him standing beside her with all his careful containment slightly less carefully maintained than usual, and thought this was a beginning of something, even if neither of them was ready to use that word yet. They danced twice. He was not a practiced dancer, but he was precise and steady, and she liked the way he held her with care and with a concentration, as though getting it right mattered to him personally. She liked the way he smelled, too clean soap and something outside, like grass and wind. And she liked the way, when the second dance ended and they were briefly close together in the moment before the bow and the stepping back, she could see something in his eyes that he had not yet found words for. They sat at a table near the door after that and talked. This was the discovery of the evening, that Patrick Winslow could talk, given the right circumstances, and that what was underneath the wall was not emptiness, but rather a great deal of accumulated thought and feeling that had simply had no outlet. He talked about his father carefully at first, then with more ease. About the way his father had built Ladder Creek from a single quarter section, adding land as he earned it, the way a man builds a house one board at a time. About the particular quality of his father's hands, which had been enormous and which could, with equal facility, doctor a sick calf or do fine carpenter work. About the morning he had found him, 3 days into a cattle drive, sitting against a wagon wheel in a way that meant he was not sitting but had fallen, and how the sky had been a particular shade of blue that Patrick had never been able to look at without remembering. Maude listened the way she did everything fully and precisely, not letting her attention drift, giving him the respect of her complete attention. "I am sorry," she said. "That is a terrible thing to carry." "I have had years with it," he said. "It does not work the same way it did." "But it works," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it works." She told him about her own father, a quiet, methodical man who had farmed the same land in southern Missouri for 40 years, and who had taught her that the most valuable thing you could know was how things worked, because things would always be breaking, and the person who could fix them would always have a place in the world. She told him about the repair shop in Wichita, and the particular satisfaction of a mechanism that had been seizing or failing or making wrong noises, suddenly running clean and right. She told him about the letter from Clara and the supply wagon and Gerald Finch with his pipe tobacco and his grunts. He listened to her the way she had listened to him, and she noticed this, because most men did not listen this way. Most men used the time when another person was speaking to prepare what they were going to say next. Patrick Winslow was listening to what she was actually saying, and the difference was considerable. They left the dance at 10 o'clock and he drove her back to Clara's, and they sat in the wagon in front of the house for a while, not talking, just existing in the same space, which felt natural in a way that might have surprised them both if they had thought about it too carefully. "I would like to see you again," he said finally. "Not in a social setting necessarily, just—" He stopped. "I would like to see you again." "I would like that too," she said. "Are you free Thursday evening?" "I can make Thursday evening work," she said. He helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the door, and at the door there was a moment, a long, close, warm moment in which everything that had not yet been said hung in the air between them like the smell of rain before it falls. And then he touched the brim of his hat and said good night, and she said good night, and she went inside. Clara was awake in the parlor with her needlework, which did not fool anyone. "Say nothing," Maude said. "I was knitting," Clara said. "You do not knit." Clara looked at the needles in her hands. "I have developed an interest in it." Maude went upstairs to her room and lay on her bed with her dress still on, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way Patrick Winslow had said, "I would like to see you again," with the careful, deliberate weight of someone making a true statement, not a polite one, and felt the warmth in her chest that she had been attributing to the heat rearrange itself into something she could no longer reasonably explain away. The Thursday evening visit became a Thursday evening tradition, and then it became a Wednesday and Thursday, and then it stopped being organized around specific days and became instead the natural pattern of two people who wanted to be where the other one was. He came to help her fix the fence on the east side of Clara's property one afternoon and stayed until the stars came out, and Clara fed them both dinner without comment. Maude rode out to Ladder Creek on a Saturday morning in August to look at a water trough that was losing pressure, which turned out to be a cracked seal, and she repaired it in half an hour, and then spent the rest of the morning sitting on the fence of the main paddock watching him work with his horses, which was the most quietly beautiful thing she had seen in some time. He was different on his own land. The wall was still there. She did not expect it to disappear overnight or perhaps ever entirely, but it was lower, and she could see over it, and what she saw was a man who loved what he was doing and who was capable of a kind of focused tenderness in his work that he clearly never applied to himself. "You are good with them," she said, watching him work a young quarter horse through its paces in the paddock. "They do not have ulterior motives," he said, without irony. "Do you think people have ulterior motives?" He considered this. "I think people want things from each other. I am not always sure the wanting is bad, but it makes things complicated." "What do you want from me?" she asked. He stopped. The horse moved away and stood at the far end of the paddock, watching them with its large, incurious eyes. Patrick Winslow turned and looked at Maude sitting on the fence in her practical skirt and her sensible boots with the early August light on her face, and she saw him decide to be honest, which was not always his first instinct but was, she was learning, always his final one. "I want you to keep being here," he said. It was not a declaration. It was more like a statement of fact, simple and undecorated, the way he said everything. She felt it land in her chest with the quiet, certain weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being said. "I am here," she said. He nodded once and went back to the horse, and she sat on the fence and watched him, and the day went on around them both, brilliant and uncomplicated, and she thought, this is what happiness feels like when it is not trying to be anything other than itself. August deepened and August passed, and September came in cooler and with a quality of light that was different from summer light, cleaner and more direct, as though the sky had been wrung out. The cottonwood trees along Clara's back fence went gold, and the grasses on the prairie turned from straw to bronze, and the mornings had the first bite of the coming cold. There were other things happening in those weeks, the things that always happen in a town and on the land around it. There was a dispute between two ranchers on the southern end of the county over water rights that had been building for 2 years, and that came to a head in late August with a great deal of legal noise and not much resolution. There was a bad stretch of dry weather that had people watching the sky with the particular anxiety of those whose livelihoods depend on what the sky decides to do. And there was, in the broader world of Kansas in 1883, the ongoing reality of what the land itself had cost, the dispossession of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who had lived on these plains for generations, whose losses were enormous and were spoken of in town mostly as though they had already happened somewhere else and long ago, which was a convenient untruth that Maude found herself returning to when she looked at the landscape and tried to understand what it was and what it had been. She said this to Patrick one evening when they were sitting on the porch of Ladder Creek with coffee and the night coming in from the east. "This land," she said, "do you think about what it cost?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "My father thought about it. He said once that you could not put honest work into land without eventually asking yourself what the land was before you came to it. He did not have an answer. I do not either, but I do not think that excuses not asking." "It does not resolve anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "It does not, but I have come to think that asking is not nothing." She looked at the dark horizon, the land she was beginning to know. "I have come to think that too," she said. In October, something happened that had nothing to do with pumps or windmills or dances or the careful architecture of two people learning to trust each other, and yet it changed everything. Maude received a letter from her Uncle Horace. She read it at the kitchen table while Clara was out and then set it down and sat with it for a long time. Horace had retired. He was closing the repair shop. He was writing to let her know, and also to let her know that a man in Wichita who had heard about her through the business community had written to offer her a position managing a new machine repair operation that he was opening. It was a good position, good wages. A real professional opportunity of the kind that was unusual and notable for a woman in 1883, and Horace was clearly proud and clearly hoping she would take it. She stared at the letter for a long time. Then she put it in her pocket and went about her day. She did not mention it to Clara that evening. She did not mention it to Patrick when she saw him on Thursday. She turned it over in her mind for 3 days, which was longer than she usually took to think through a problem, and the reason it was taking longer was that the problem had grown considerably more complex than the words on the paper suggested. She liked her life here. She had not expected to like it as much as she did. She had come for a practical purpose, to do a job, and the job was still here, and Clara still needed her. And the truth was that in 6 weeks she had put down roots in this dry Kansas soil without intending to, and the deepest of those roots ran in the direction of a ranch 4 miles east of town, and a man who said very little and meant considerable amounts more than he said. On the 4th day she told Clara. Clara read the letter carefully. Then she set it down on the table between them with the precision of someone putting something in a place where it can be looked at honestly. "What do you want to do?" Clara asked. "I do not know," Maude said, "which is unusual for me." "It is unusual when the question is not about what you want professionally but about what you want entirely," Clara said. "Those are different questions." "The professional opportunity is real," Maude said. "I worked for 3 years to be the kind of person who gets an offer like this." "Yes," Clara said. "And Hays City is not Wichita," Clara said. "No," Maude looked at the table. "No, it is not. Has Patrick said anything to you about the future, about intentions?" "He is not a man who speaks about intentions," Maude said. "No," Clara agreed. "But he is a man who acts on them. Look at what he has done in the past 2 months, Maude. That man rearranged the structure of his whole life to make room for you in it. He has not said it in words, but he has said it." Maude sat with this. She thought about the fence he had helped her fix, and the way he had stayed for dinner, and the evenings on the porch at Ladder Creek, and the way he had listened to her in the Grange Hall with his complete attention, and the way he had said, "I want you to keep being here in the paddock in August with the young quarter horse watching from the far end with its enormous and curious eyes." "I need to tell him about the letter," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "You do." She rode out to Ladder Creek that afternoon. He was in the barn when she arrived, working on a bridle with the focused attention he brought to everything that needed his hands. He looked up when she came through the barn door, and something in her face must have told him that this was not an ordinary visit. "What is it?" he asked. She told him about the letter. She said it plainly and directly, the way she did everything, without softening it or dramatizing it. She told him about the offer and the wages and the opportunity, and the fact that she had been sitting with it for 4 days and was not yet sure what she was going to do. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not react in the way she had half feared, with the cold withdrawal of someone who does not know how to respond to being presented with the possibility of loss. He just listened, and when she was done, he set the bridle down and looked at the barn floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to know what you think," she said. "I asked first." She almost smiled. "Almost." "I think I want to stay," she said. I think I have put something here that I did not expect to put here, and I am not sure I can take it with me if I leave." She paused. "But I also think that a woman who spent 3 years earning a reputation in a field where most people would prefer she did not exist has to take seriously an offer that acknowledges what she has built. I cannot simply walk away from that without understanding what I am walking away to." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long time. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and leather and horses, and outside the wind moved through the grass with that soft autumn sound. "I should have said something before this," he said. "I have been meaning to. I kept waiting until he stopped. "I kept waiting until I was certain you were not going to think I was," he stopped again, and this time something genuinely frustrated crossed his face, the expression of a man whose interior is far richer than his ability to navigate the exterior route to it. "Patrick," she said quietly. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want Maude, I want you here, not because of the windmill or the pump or the fence. Because when I am with you I am," he looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "I am less afraid," he said. "I did not realize I was afraid until you showed me what it felt like not to be." The barn was very quiet. Maude felt something in her chest that was too large to be comfortable and too real to ignore. "That is the most you have ever said to me at one time," she said. Something softened in his expression. "I have been composing it for several weeks," he admitted. She crossed the distance between them and stood close to him, close enough to feel the warmth from him, and she looked up at him and she said, "I am not going to Wichita." He looked at her. "I am going to write to the man in Wichita and thank him for the offer and tell him that my circumstances have changed," she said. "And I am going to tell Clara that I am staying, which she has probably already assumed. And I am going to keep fixing things because that is what I do and I am good at it, and I think there is enough here that needs fixing to keep me busy for quite some time." "There is," he said, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard there before, something warm and open and without armor. "Patrick," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to kiss me, or are we going to stand here being reasonable at each other indefinitely?" He looked startled. And then he laughed, a real laugh from somewhere genuine, the kind of laugh that sounds like something that has been shut up for too long being finally let out into the air. And then he cupped her face in his large, work-roughened hands with a gentleness that was extraordinary coming from those hands, and he kissed her, and it was the beginning of the rest of the story. They were engaged before December. He asked her on a cold, clear evening in November, standing on the porch of Ladder Creek with the first stars out and his breath making small clouds in the air, and he asked without ceremony or preamble, the way he did everything honest, directly, without decoration, but with his whole heart in it. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you will have me. I am aware that I have," he paused. "I have a great deal of room for improvement in the area of expressing things." "I like the way you express things," she said. "You are being generous." "I am being accurate," she said. "You express things exactly as much as I need you to." "I am not a woman who needs a great deal of decorative speech, Patrick. I need honesty and I need someone who means what they say. You are both of those things." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring simple, with a small pale stone that caught the starlight, and she recognized it immediately because Clara had mentioned it once briefly as having belonged to his mother. She felt the weight of what he was giving her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger with the focused care he put into all fine work, and she stood in the cold November night with her heart very full and her mind very clear, and the sense of something enormous settling into place, the way a well-made joint settles when the final peg is driven home. They were married in the spring, in April of 1884, in the Hayes City Church on the corner of Main and 2nd. It was a small ceremony by most standards and exactly right by theirs. Clara in the front pew looking simultaneously fierce and deeply moved. Bert Haverson from the hardware store in attendance. Several of the ranching families from surrounding land. A few of Clara's boarders who had adopted Maude as something between a fellow tenant and a younger sister over the preceding months. Patrick stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat and looked at Maude walking toward him down the aisle, and the expression on his face was one that nobody who knew him had ever seen before, entirely open, entirely unguarded, the face of a man who has put down every piece of armor he was carrying and stood still to let someone see him clearly. Maude walked toward him in a cream dress that Clara had helped her put together, with her dark hair pinned up, and the simple ring already on her finger that she had worn since November, and she felt the truth of this moment in her bones, that this was right, not in the soft, dreamy way of stories that do not account for difficulty, but in the way of something built well and built honestly, with real materials and real knowledge of what you were making. She took his hands at the altar. His hands, she thought. Those large, careful, work-scarred hands that had looked at a wrench the way other men looked at a sword, as the measure of their own sufficiency. Those hands that had never in 29 years wanted help and had finally, improbably, accepted it, and found that what they got in the bargain was something he had not known he was missing. The minister spoke. They made their promises. When it was done and Patrick kissed her, and the small congregation made the sounds that small congregations make at such moments, Clara sat in the front pew with a handkerchief that she was using with complete unself-consciousness, which Maude noticed, and which she intended to bring up at the earliest appropriate moment. The reception was in Clara's front parlor, which Clara had decorated with paper flowers and dried lavender, and which smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and sugar cake. There was music from a neighbor who played the harmonica with more enthusiasm than precision, but with unmistakable joy, and people ate and talked, and the afternoon went on in the good, unhurried way of celebrations that are marking something real. Patrick sat beside her the whole time and did not disappear to stand against a wall, and she noted this without comment but with deep satisfaction. That evening, as the light went low and golden through Clara's parlor windows and the last guests were taking their leave, Clara took Maude's hands in hers briefly, firmly, and looked at her with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "You are going to be very happy," she said. "It was not a wish. It was an assessment." "I know," Maude said. She moved to Ladder Creek Ranch that week. She had known the house from her visits, but knowing it as a visitor and knowing it as the person who lived in it were entirely different things, and she spent the first few weeks in a quiet, thorough process of understanding what the house needed, how the light moved through it at different hours, which floorboard was the one that spoke in the night, the way the wind came from the northwest in the afternoon, and what it did to the doors. She organized the kitchen with a systematic efficiency that Patrick watched with something between relief and entertainment. She found a wall in the back bedroom that she was almost certain was hollow and tapped it at intervals until she identified the spot where moisture was getting in from outside and repaired the caulking around the external window frame, which resolved a small but persistent mold problem that Patrick had been pretending did not exist for 2 years. "You knew about that," she said when she found it. "I had some awareness of it," he said. "Why did you not fix it?" "I was hoping it would resolve on its own." She looked at him. "It was a small issue," he said. "Patrick," she said, "that is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people a compromised wall in November." "You are very formidable about moisture damage," he said. "I am formidable about all structural issues," she said. "I know," he said, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not a complaint but a statement of deep and genuine appreciation, and she felt that warm, particular thing in her chest again, the thing she had given up trying to name because the name for it was simply him, simply this, simply the life they were building. The ranch changed under their combined attention. Patrick had always been competent and hardworking, but there had been, in the machinery of Ladder Creek, a persistent quality of managed decline, things that worked but not well, things that had been jury-rigged because the root problem was harder to solve alone. With Maude's mechanical understanding applied alongside his knowledge of the land and the animals, things began to work better. Not just the windmill, which ran without incident from the day she fixed it, but the water distribution to the paddocks, the gate mechanisms, the irrigation to the kitchen garden, the small smokehouse at the back of the property that had been only partially functional for years. She also began, quietly and without announcement, to build a small repair service. It started because Bert Haverson mentioned to a neighboring rancher that the woman at Ladder Creek knew what she was doing with mechanisms, and the rancher came out with a broken wagon jack, and she fixed it in 30 minutes. And word traveled the way it does in places where people depend on their equipment and good help is not easily found. Patrick said nothing about this for a while. He watched it develop, the occasional wagon pulling up to the ranch, the work spreading out onto the wide porch in pleasant weather, the sound of Maude's voice explaining a repair to someone who nodded, along with the absorbed attention of a person who has found the source of a persistent problem. And one evening he said, "You need a proper workspace." "I have been thinking that," she said. "There is the old storage shed by the barn. I can make it weathertight and put in a proper workbench and a window on the north face." She looked at him. "You would do that?" Of course, he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which was itself a thing that moved her, the absolute absence of question in it, the complete ease with which he was offering to build her a place for her own work to live. Patrick, she said. Maude, he said. Nothing, she said. I just nothing. He built her the workshop through May. He was a good carpenter, she had known this, had seen evidence of it in the careful workmanship of various elements of the house, but she had not seen him build something from the beginning, and watching him frame out the walls with the same methodical focus and precise attention he brought to everything else was its own kind of revelation. The finished space was simple and functional, and had a north-facing window that gave the particular clean light that is best for close work. She set up her workbench and her tools, and she stood in the doorway of her workshop on the first morning, and felt the rightness of it in a way she had no words for, the sense of a life that was entirely hers, built with her own knowledge and her own hands and her own choices, on land she had come to know and love, beside a man she loved in the clear-eyed, practical, committed way that she loved everything worth loving. The summer of 1884 was good. The rains came at the right times, which was not always guaranteed on the Kansas plains, and the grass stayed green longer than the previous year, and the cattle on Ladder Creek put on weight, and the calves all came through, and there was a quality to that summer that felt like a period of uncomplicated rightness, of people and place aligned in their purposes. They hired a ranch hand in June, a young man of 20 named Thomas Briggs from a family in the area who had grown up working land and knew horses and cattle and was, Patrick noted with some surprise, easy to work with, which meant that either Thomas was exceptional or Patrick had developed a greater tolerance for human company than he had previously possessed. Both things were true. Maude hired a young woman of 17 named Eliza Pierce as a part-time assistant in the workshop, not for mechanical work initially, but for keeping records, which had accumulated in a state of disorder that was unworthy of the actual quality of Maude's work. Eliza turned out to have an excellent mechanical mind of her own, and Maude began teaching her the basics with the quiet, methodical thoroughness that she had learned from her father, giving Eliza the same gift she had been given, which was the knowledge that the world made mechanical sense to anyone who took the time to understand it. In October of 1884, Maude knew she was expecting a child. She told Patrick in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, simply and directly, watching his face. What happened to his face was remarkable. It went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, which was followed immediately by something she could only describe as the complete dissolution of the last remaining piece of the wall, the final piece, the deepest piece, the piece that had been there since the morning he had found his father sitting against a wagon wheel, and understood for the first time that the world could take things from you without warning and without apology. That piece came down now, and what was underneath it was not what he had been protecting against, but what he had always been capable of, an openness so complete and so unguarded that it made her breath catch. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her, not desperately, not with the clutching quality of someone afraid, but with the steady, encompassing quality of a man who has come home to something he did not know he was capable of reaching. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am not a delicate person." "I know you are not," he said. "I am asking anyway." "Then yes, I am well. I am very well." He held on for another moment. Then he stepped back and looked at her with those dark, honest eyes, and she could see that something had shifted in him, something fundamental, the final realignment of a man who had spent years living only in the outward direction and had now found a center to live from. "I am going to be a father," he said. "You are," she said. "I do not know that I know how," he said. "Neither does anyone," she said. "You learn the same way you learn everything else. You make it sound simple." "I make it sound possible," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am going to need help," he said. It cost him something to say it, not as much as it once would have, but still something. He was a man for whom self-sufficiency had been the cornerstone of identity for most of his adult life, and the willingness to acknowledge need was still a thing he had to reach for even now, even with her. She recognized this. She loved him for saying it. "You are going to have it," she said. "You have Clara and Thomas and Eliza and me. That is 4 people. You are not doing this alone." He nodded. Something settled in his face. "Good," he said, and then very quietly, "Good." Clara was, as expected, the reaction that Maude most enjoyed. She sat down again, the second time in Maude's experience at Ladder Creek, and then she stood up and embraced Maude with the fierce, slightly frightening embrace of a woman who has not allowed herself much softness and is making up for lost time. And then she composed herself and began making a list of everything that would need to be prepared. The pregnancy was straightforward, as Maude had firmly intended it to be. She continued her work through most of it. Not the heavy lifting, she conceded that much to practicality, but the fine mechanical work, the workshop, the repair service, the teaching of Eliza, all of it continued. Patrick hovered with a subtlety that was, given his nature, not particularly subtle, appearing at the workshop door at intervals with water or coffee or no stated reason at all, finding tasks that required him to be in proximity without acknowledging that this was what he was doing. She found this deeply endearing and told him so. He said he did not know what she was talking about. She said she knew he did not. They both understood each other perfectly. Their son was born in the spring, in May of 1885, and they named him Robert after Patrick's father. He arrived in the world at Ladder Creek with Clara present and a capable midwife from town, and he was healthy and loud, and had, from the very first moments of his life, an expression of absolute confidence in his own requirements that suggested he had not inherited his father's reluctance to ask for help. Patrick held Robert for the first time with the same focused care he brought to all delicate things. The way he had put the ring on her finger on a cold November night, the way he had framed the walls of her workshop, and the expression on his face was one that Maude thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. It was not the exalted, transcendent expression of stories. It was simpler and realer than that. It was the face of a man who has been given something he was afraid to want and is discovering in the moment of receiving it that the fear had nothing on the thing itself. "Hello, Robert," he said. The baby looked at him with the unfocused, absolute attention of the very new. "He has your eyes," Maude said from the bed. "He has your mouth," Patrick said. "It is going to get him into trouble." "My mouth," she said, "has never got me into trouble." "Your mouth," he said, looking at her over the top of their son's head, "once told me in the middle of the Hayes City hardware store that I had been fixing the symptoms and not the problem, which started a chain of events that ended here." He paused. "Whether that is trouble is a question of perspective." "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I have said more romantic things than that." "Name one." He looked at their son. He looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the bedroom window, and the world outside was green and alive with the particular May quality that Kansas had when it was being its best self, and the ranch that had been, for 7 years, a man's solitary effort to honor his father by keeping something alive was now, also, a family, a real and working and imperfect and sufficient family. "I want you to keep being here," he said. She remembered the paddock in August 1883. The young quarter horse at the far end, the light. "I remember," she said. "I meant it then," he said. "I mean it more now." "I know you do," she said. Robert slept in his father's arms with the complete confidence of someone who had landed in exactly the right place. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, not slowly or quickly, but with a fullness that meant when you looked back at them they seemed rich with detail, dense with living. 1885 into 1886 into 1887, and the ranch grew and changed. Patrick expanded the cattle operation with a steadiness that was characteristic of everything he did, never rashly, always with the next several steps accounted for. Maude's repair workshop developed a reputation that extended beyond Hayes City into surrounding towns, and she began receiving work from as far as 20 miles away, which was, for 1886 in western Kansas, a substantial distance, and a substantial acknowledgement of competence. She took Eliza on as a full partner in the workshop in the spring of 1887, formalizing what had already been the functional arrangement for a year. Eliza, at 20, had become a genuinely skilled mechanic with a particular gift for the internal workings of water distribution systems, which made sense given how much of their work in that dry country had to do with water and its management. The sign that Maude had never gotten around to putting up outside the workshop read, in Patrick's careful lettering, Abbott Pierce Mechanical Services, which Eliza had wept over briefly and then denied weeping over. Thomas Briggs had become indispensable to Ladder Creek by this point. He was 23 in 1887 and had the kind of steady character that grew with responsibility, and Patrick had given him more of it each year. There was also, between Thomas and Eliza, a mutual awareness that had been developing for several months with the quiet inevitability of things that are simply obvious to everyone except the people involved, and Maude and Patrick discussed it on several evenings with the comfortable intimacy of people who have been watching the same thing develop and have reached the same conclusions. "He is going to ask her," Patrick said one evening. "He is building up to it," Maude agreed. "He has been building up to it for about 4 months. Should we say something?" Maude looked at him. "Never mind," he said. "Thomas will get there," she said. "Some men just need a little longer to find the words." She paused. "I have some experience with this phenomenon." He looked at her sideways. "That was years ago." "It was 4 years ago," she said. "I remember it very clearly. I said what I needed to say." "You said it beautifully," she agreed. "It just took a while." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have improved." "You have improved remarkably," she said. "I am very proud of you." He made a sound that was somewhere between skepticism and amusement, and pulled her slightly closer against his side, which was its own kind of statement. And the evening settled around them on the porch of Ladder Creek, with the late summer sky going from orange to pink to the deep blue of coming night. Robert was 2.5 and asleep inside, having spent the afternoon with enormous seriousness attempting to assist Thomas with the repair of a paddock fence, and contributing primarily the entertainment of watching a small person explain to a post-hole digger why it was not cooperating. Maude thought, on evenings like this, about the road, about the supply wagon and Gerald Finch and his pipe tobacco, and the letter from Clara about a boarding house that needed a competent person, and the hardware store with Bert Haverson and the copper pipe fittings, and the moment she had turned halfway and seen Patrick Winslow for the first time with his list, and his worn hat and his voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary volume. She thought about the windmill in the heat of that July, and the 4 minutes it had taken her to identify and fix what he had spent weeks trying to understand, and the 2 words he had said with everything else contained inside them. She thought about the truth she had learned in that barn on a hot afternoon, that thank you can mean so much more than gratitude, can mean the acknowledgement of having been wrong and the acceptance of help, and the beginning of the understanding that self-sufficiency taken to its extreme becomes a kind of poverty, and that the bravest thing a person who has decided to need no one can do is to say thank you and mean all the rest of it. She had meant a few things in return. She still did. She would. Their daughter came in the winter of 1888, arriving in December with a spectacular, opinionated insistence on making her presence known from the first moment. They named her Frances, after Maude's mother, who had been a quiet and steady woman whom Maude had loved deeply. Frances was, immediately and apparently permanently, the loudest person on Ladder Creek Ranch, which, given that her father was a man who had spent years speaking as little as possible, and her mother was a woman of precise and economical speech, was both unexpected and entirely appropriate. Patrick held Frances the way he had held Robert, with that same focused tenderness. But there was a difference this time, a greater ease, the ease of a man who has done this before and who knows, from the evidence of Robert, that he does not break things that are placed in his care. Robert regarded his new sister from a safe distance, with the cautious assessment of a 3-year-old, evaluating an unknown variable. The conclusion he reached, after several days of careful study, was that Francis was interesting, and that this was worth something, and he settled into the role of older brother with a seriousness that made Patrick laugh and Maude think, with a warmth she carried close, that her son had his father's quality of attention and his mother's quality of precision, and that the combination would serve him very well. Clara came for Christmas that year and stayed for 2 weeks, and was in her element in a way that transformed her. At Clara's boarding house she was the manager, the authority, the person responsible for everything. At Ladder Creek at Christmas, with Robert climbing on her and Francis being passed into her arms and Patrick pulling a chair up to the stove for her without being asked, and Maude producing a meal that filled the kitchen with warmth and the smell of good things, she was simply and beautifully a member of a family. She left on a cold January morning with her usual firm handshake and her usual composed expression, and Maude walked her to the wagon and hugged her, which Clara bore with dignity and said, "Come back in spring." "I will consider it," Clara said. "Clara." "I will come in spring," Clara said, and got into the wagon, and Maude watched her go down the road toward Hayes City and felt the fullness of it, the completeness of a life that contained all of this, all of these people, all of this belonging. She stood in the cold January morning for a moment. The sky was pale and enormous, and the plains ran out in every direction under a thin coat of frost. The windmill turned in the northwest wind with a clean, smooth motion, the sound of water moving through the pipe steady and right. She heard the door behind her, and Patrick came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without comment, because he knew where she would be and what she would need. The way you know these things about a person when you have paid the kind of attention to them that matters. She took the coffee and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood watching the land, their land, the land that had cost something to everyone who had ever lived on it, and that cost something still. And that was also, genuinely and undeniably, there's their work and their sweat and their knowledge and their care threaded into every post and fence and repaired mechanism and smoothly running pump. "Good Christmas," she said. "Best one I can remember," he said. "You say that every year." "Every year I mean it." She looked up at him, he looked down at her. After nearly 5 years of marriage, he still had the quality, in unguarded moments like this one, of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck, not with the helpless quality of someone who expects luck to reverse, but with the quieter, more settled quality of a man who has decided to be grateful for it every day without reservation. "I love you," she said. "I know you do," he said. Then, "I love you, Maude, more than I can say. More than I knew was possible when I was the man who did not know he needed anything." She put her hand against his chest, over his heartbeat. "You just said considerably more than usual," she said. "I have been improving," he said. "You have," she agreed. "You are getting very good at it." The plains stretched out around them in the January cold, enormous and clean and indifferent to their happiness, which was fine because their happiness was not asking the plains for an opinion. It was sufficient in itself. In the warmth of the coffee and the warmth of his arm and the warmth from the house behind them, where Robert and Francis were making the particular sounds of small people whose lives are full of safety and love, in the windmill turning clean in the northwest wind, in the workshop across the yard with its north-facing window and its neat rows of tools, in the years behind them and the years still ahead, unmapped and ready. Thomas did ask Eliza, as it happened in the spring of 1889. He came to Patrick first, which was the custom, and Patrick gave his blessing with a directness and sincerity that Thomas had apparently not fully anticipated, because he went away slightly stunned and considerably moved. The wedding was in June, a small ceremony in town, and Maude stood next to Clara in the church and watched the 2 young people making their promises and thought about her own promises and felt the weight of them, which was not the weight of burden but the weight of something real and built and good. The summer of 1889 was hot and long and full of work, and the particular contentment of people who have found the shape of their days and are satisfied with it. Robert turned 4 and then 5, and in 1890, when he was 5, he began trailing his mother into the workshop with a focused curiosity that eventually produced, by his 6th birthday, a child who could identify every tool on the bench by name and knew the purpose of each one. Patrick watched this with an expression that he clearly thought was neutral, and that was in fact suffused with the kind of pride that has no idea how visible it is. Francis, at 2 in 1890, had already established a personality of such definite character that everyone at Ladder Creek had begun instinctively deferring to her preferences, which Patrick claimed to find alarming and which Maude privately found deeply satisfying. In 1891, when Maude was 32 and Patrick 37, the well on the south side of the property developed a problem. The pump mechanism had a bearing failure that was causing the whole assembly to shake and lose pressure, and it was in a configuration she had not worked on before, an older style of mechanism that required some study before the repair. She worked on it for most of a Saturday, going at it with the patient, systematic attention that she brought to all difficult problems, trying things, rejecting approaches, taking the assembly apart again when an approach did not produce the right result, studying the geometry of the failure until she understood it clearly enough to address it at its actual source. Patrick came out late in the afternoon and stood watching her work. "Do you need—" he started. She looked up at him. He stopped, reconsidered. "Do you want some water?" he said. She smiled. "Yes, thank you." He brought her water and sat down on the edge of the well housing and watched her work with the quality of attention he had always given her work. The complete, interested attention of someone who finds what they are watching genuinely remarkable and who does not feel the need to manage or direct it, only to witness it. She had the bearing replaced and the assembly running clean by the time the sun was an hour from setting, and she stood up and stretched and looked at the properly functioning pump with satisfaction. "Well?" Patrick asked. "Better than well," she said, which was a terrible joke and she knew it. He looked at her. "That was a very bad joke." "I have been saving it," she admitted. He stood up and took the water cup from her hand and set it aside and kissed her, there beside the repaired well in the late afternoon sun, with the horses in the far paddock and the windmill turning in the slow October breeze, and the sound from the house of Robert explaining something at length to a Francis who was probably not listening. "Thank you," he said when the kiss was done. She looked at him. Those words in that voice with that meaning. The same 2 words that had started it all, said in the same quiet, serious way, with the same depth underneath them that she had heard the first time, except that now what was underneath them was not surprise at being helped but the full and certain knowledge of everything she was, everything she brought, everything they were together. "You are welcome," she said, and she meant it. All of it, all the layers, all the years, all the fixed things and the things that would yet need fixing and the knowledge between them that fixing them together was always going to be better than fixing them alone. He put his arm around her and they walked back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the chimney and the voices of their children, and the smell of something good coming from the kitchen where Eliza, who had taken to visiting on weekend afternoons now that she and Thomas lived on the neighboring property, was apparently cooking something without having been asked, which was the kind of help that arrives without announcement and sits down at the table and makes itself at home. The door opened as they came up the porch steps and Robert appeared in the doorway, 6 years old and serious-faced and carrying a wrench that was approximately as large as his torso, and said with great dignity, "The kitchen stove gate is stuck again." Maude looked at Patrick. Patrick looked at Maude. "Go with your mother," Patrick said. "She will show you how to fix it." Robert looked at Maude with the absolute confidence of a child who has never doubted that the person in front of him can solve any problem presented to them, and said, "All right. Come on, Mama." She took the wrench from him before he could damage something with it, and went inside, and fixed the stove gate, and showed him exactly how and why, the way her father had shown her, the way things worth knowing get passed along hand to hand, person to person, generation to generation, on good land under enormous skies in the middle of a world that kept breaking and kept being fixed by the people who knew how. And the land held them all, the way land does when it has been worked honestly and loved genuinely. And the seasons moved through their turns, and the windmill turned in the wind, clean and smooth and right. And the water ran through the pipes and filled the troughs and the well and fed the roots of things. And Ladder Creek Ranch was full of sound and warmth, and the particular kind of life that is built not from grand gestures but from 10,000 small, true acts of care, a cotter ring replaced. A wall sealed against the weather, a thank you that meant more, a door always left open because the person who needed to come through it had already found the way.